Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is John Partridge. I'm a resident of the City of Providence at 9 John Street. My comments are my own comments and do not reflect necessarily the comments of my law firm or my clients or any group that which I may be affiliated with. So I am here as an independent voice. I'd like to begin my presentation by noting that I have some thoughts with regard to Article 14, Section 2, relating to the call of the Constitutional Convention and my experience as a delegate to the 1973 convention which proposed the article. As a delegate to that convention, I can assure the panel that the adoption of Section 2 by the convention was a hard-nosed fight. Many delegates opposed the amendment, and they were mostly openly aligned with the General Assembly or with politics in one way or the other. And if you look at the roll call votes, you'll see those connections. It was the last major consideration for that convention and went right down to the wire. A very hotly contested and very close vote. I might add that the 1973 convention, to my best information, cost the state between $20,000 and $25,000. $20,000 and $25,000. Not $2 million, not $1 million, not $500,000. Between $20,000 and $25,000. The real reason why the General Assembly wanted to have a Constitutional Convention in 1973 was that it wanted to remove the constitutional ban on lotteries, which, by the way, it did. The General Assembly wanted a limited convention. However, the Attorney General, that was Richard Israel at the time, notified the presiding officers of the convention that, in his opinion, a Constitutional Convention, once established, could not be limited as to subject matter as to its call. Whether that's a correct reading of the law or not, that's probably an open question. However, the leadership of the convention, and that was principally Judge Powers, who was William Powers, a retired Supreme Court justice, and Joe O'Donnell, a former lieutenant governor of the state of Rhode Island, believed that the issue was such and that the limited call could not, in fact, be followed. And of particular interest to me as a delegate was the Providence Journal was on strike. So therefore, there was no Providence Journal, and there was, in fact, no reporting on many of the issues that occurred during that convention. The television stations in those days were not interested in such thing. So as a practical matter, there was no information as to the politics of the convention nor the coalitions that were established during the convention, or in fact very much at all until in fact the convention was through with its work. And then finally the Sunday Journal of the time did publish a long piece by various people in the newsroom about what had actually happened over the prior 2 weeks. Now, many of the delegates, some of whom I would say would be self-identified today as progressives, were very, very instrumental in the convention. And as a practical matter, if you remember 1972-73, we had the tragedy of Watergate and Richard Nixon in Washington. We had other issues of a similar ethical nature going on, and people were very concerned about ethics. And as a result, all kinds of people with various political persuasions joined together in obtaining the convention approval, including the progressives, over a determined opposition on both the questions of whether or not a convention should be called every 10 years, which was opposed by those identified with the General Assembly, as well as the very important disclosure requirement for campaign contributions. That was put into the Constitution at that time, requiring the General Assembly to enact the first campaign disclosures. And by the way, it didn't do it in its first legislative session. They had to call a special session thereafter because the then president, or I guess chief majority leader in the Senate, refused to take up the issue at all. So you can understand why some of us would be concerned about whether or not we have a convention at this time. So with regard to the preparatory commission, what did the delegates in 73 expect would occur? I'm very pleased that the chair announced his own thoughts on that matter. First, we expected the General Assembly would establish the commission well in advance of the vote on whether there should be a convention. The common thought at the time would be a year in advance. A year in advance. Secondly, it was thought it would be comprised primarily of non-members of the General Assembly. In fact, it was a surprise even now that it's a majority from the General Assembly. principally because of the many constitutional issues that affect the General Assembly, and that creates potential conflicts. Thirdly, there would be a written report given to the voters well in advance of the question on the ballot. And lastly, it was thought the Preparatory Commission would not take positions with regard to individual issues. The Preparatory Commission would instead determine the principal issues that might be considered, suggest pros and cons on those issues, so that the issues could be robustly debated. In that regard, it is important that we look to the constitutional language with regard to the Preparatory Commission. Its role was and is to assemble information on constitutional questions for the electors, not to take positions thereon. I note that many delegates, including myself, did not feel the time we had the votes for more specificity with regard to that provision. It was the last night. We were trying to get home, get out of a very warm House of Representatives that was not air-conditioned in those days, and complete the convention. So with that background, my first issue relating to why I support a constitutional convention is to amend Article 14, Section 2, to make it clear that the membership of the Preparatory Commission would not be dominated by General Assembly members, that the Preparatory Commission would be established a year in advance of the vote on the issue by the electors, clarify the preparatory role of the Preparatory Commission, and lastly, made clear that the Commission would have a budget in order to inform the electors of its right of assemblage of such information. My next issue is with regard to the election of general officers, particularly Governor, Lieutenant Governor, and Attorney General. I do not believe these officers should be elected by less than 40% of the electors. Should the election winner receive less than 40%, there should be a runoff for those positions. I believe it is worth the cost for many, many reasons, not the least of which is to ensure that our majority rule democratic philosophy, small d, is not damaged by multiple candidates and parties, resulting in election of a candidate with the support of a distinct minority of voters. Given the possible number of candidates under our present laws, a 5 or 10 person ballot could permit someone with 20% or less to be declared elected to one of these important offices. Such an elected official would be unlikely to receive support for many of the individual's policies, and such an occurrence would disenfranchise a substantial number of voters who do not believe that someone who is elected with such a polarity reflects the will of the people, that it amounts to nothing more than a determined minority, a segment of the community, creating divisions when we should be creating unity after an election. I also take this position very strongly with regard to the mayors of Rhode Island cities, particularly Providence. My next issue is the line item veto. This is an issue that should be discussed in convention because it will never be discussed in the General Assembly. It will never be presented to the voters in any way, shape, or form unless it is through a constitutional convention. Now, there are arguments for it and there are arguments against it, and certainly one could consider limitations with regard to a line item veto scope. But that discussion will never be had in the General Assembly, so it must be left to the people assembled in a convention. The next issue that should be discussed in the Constitutional Convention is Article 12, which relates to education. The Rhode Island Supreme Court has said that in Rhode Island there is, quote, no fundamental constitutional right to an education. I want to repeat that. No fundamental constitutional right to an education. Nor does the Constitution guarantee equal, adequate, or meaningful education. Based on prior case law and Rhode Island legislative history and a literal reading of the then existing Constitution, I think the court made the right decision at the time because there is simply no provision in the Constitution that provides for equal, adequate, and meaningful education for our children. A robust debate is called for to determine the appropriate role of the General Assembly under our Constitution as to education. This should be discussed in a constitutional convention where those issues can best be fleshed out and argued. This would also engage everyone interested in education, particularly parents, teachers, and taxpayers. My next issue is the selection of judges in Article 14, Section 4. I have been involved in that process, directly and indirectly, for probably 30 years, and certainly when it was a total political process. The problem is that we have governors who ignore the timelines and statutes and appointments. We have commissions that have not been effective, and recently we've had the rise of the magistrate class. A rather simple amendment could avoid gubernatorial inaction, clarify the nature and duties of the commission, and finally include magistrates thereunder. The next issue is the Ethics Commission established through Article 3, Section 8. I have to tell you, I lost my arguments at the time of the proposal of the creation of the Ethics Commission within the Constitution as too legalistic and limiting, but I still believe in my concept, which I'll mention. The literal wording of Section 8 has caused the Rhode Island Supreme Court to say the present Article 3, Section 8, gives the Commission the powers to enact substantial ethics laws. I repeat, laws. The court did not find that this violated the constitutional rule of separation of powers. Personally, I believe most of the work of the Ethics Commission is administrative, which is staff-driven. I would rather see the administrative functions in the Secretary of State's office and use the Commission as an advisory panel who turns over violations of law and the Code of Ethics to the Attorney General's office. I find it difficult to accept that unelected individuals can, as the court says, have the power to enact substantial ethics laws. That power belongs to the General Assembly under the rule of separation of powers. The executive officers and judicial officers should have their appropriate role. I also note the Supreme Court has said the Ethics Commission may not forbid members of the General Assembly from serving on public boards, commissions, and agencies. One wonders if this should not be the case. I also know that the free debate clause and the conflict of interest policies can be reconciled and can be best debated by those in the convention rather than within an affected legislative body. It is precisely the kind of issue that should be debated in a convention. Finally, I am troubled and disappointed that many, I'll say some members of our community, many who are self-identified progressives, fail to trust the people of Rhode Island with respect to the Constitutional Convention and have raised substantial cash to defeat the proposed convention. Unheard of. Never happened before in Rhode Island. Roger Williams and the Founding Fathers and the revolutionary like Thomas Dorr must be turning in their graves. To be afraid to ask voters for their will on constitutional issues is anti-democratic. This is really a case where special interests, admittedly not all progressives, are working together against the call of a convention because they feel it threatens relationships in the General Assembly and their own sacred cows and causes. Quite frankly, they should be abashed. If they have an issue, they should run as delegates to the convention and use it as an opportunity to increase public awareness of their concerns and protect their goals. Lastly, let me reiterate that some issues are best debated on a constitutional basis in the convention forum rather than in the General Assembly, simply because the General Assembly has the most to give up or is most affected thereby. I appreciate the work of your commission. My comments as to Article 14, Section 2 in particular should not be taken as any type of personal criticism. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I have copies for the members.
Thank you, Mr. Partridge. I'd just like to add some of us in the General Assembly are still waiting for that air conditioning. You could hand up your comments to the staff, and it'll be made part of the report. Are there any questions? Mr. Frias.
Hi, Mr. Partridge. Thanks for coming forward and talking about your experience at the 1973 convention. My first question is, I've heard a couple of times from various members of the public about the cost of a convention. And I want to thank you for pointing out that the 1973 convention was as low cost as you pointed out.
I must point out, if I might, that every day during that convention period, we got a report of our administrative costs. I believe the last one that was reported was on the 8th day, according to the journal, and it was $17,000, and they thought it might get up to 20 to 25.
So my question is twofold. One, the amount that the Constitutional Convention will expend is determined by the General Assembly in a budget appropriation. Is that not correct?
That is correct.
So if the General Assembly does not want the convention to spend more than X amount of money, the General Assembly can say, I will not expend more money, correct?
That is the way it is operated in the past here in Rhode Island, except I believe in '86 when they went for an interminable period of time. I don't know whether or not they had to go back to the General Assembly or they simply used their constitutional powers as a convention, pardon me, to request funds from the state. I think the governor may have intervened in that in '86.
Well, my point I'm making is that the only authority that can appropriate public funds for a constitutional convention is the General Assembly. So the General Assembly is a check on the Constitutional Convention for its expenditure of funds.
I think that's generally correct.
Thank you.
Yep.
And I would also, following up on that, the 1973 convention approved the lottery amendment, correct?
It removed the ban. Removed the ban that was in,
yes.
For better or for worse. That was the convention. I voted to remove the ban.
Okay. I'm not getting into a casino discussion with you, believe me. I just wanted to understand is they removed the ban on lotteries. Would you agree that the removal of the ban on lotteries has brought in more revenue to the state of Rhode Island than that Constitutional Convention has expended?
I think I would agree with you with that, Mr. Frias.
Thank you.
Yep.
The other matter you brought up was a line item veto, possible constitutional amendment for a line item veto. And you indicated that as an example of something the General Assembly will likely not take up, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Basically, in the 1973 convention, that convention brought forward every 10 years, the voters will have a chance to decide when they want a convention, correct? Now, basically, isn't the convention the opportunity for voters to for the voters to possibly reject or accept amendments that could restrict, limit, or reduce the power of the General Assembly?
Well, yes. I mean, if in fact, through the convention process, the election of the delegates, the deliberations of the delegates, the final resolution within the convention, and then finally the election, yes, it could change, in fact, the nature of the way the General Assembly operates, or the size of the General Assembly, or the payment of fees to the General Assembly. Any number of things could happen. That's true.
And for instance, on the line item veto, for instance, as you indicated, possibly the only way we'll ever get a line item veto in this state would be through a constitutional convention, because the General Assembly may not have the incentive or the desire to reduce its own power, correct?
I believe that is the case. I do not believe that there has been any proposals for a line item veto for the governor from the General Assembly that's ever passed either house of the General Assembly, nor do I think it ever has in fact been introduced as a serious constitutional amendment.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I would also say I have no position on whether it's good or bad. I just think the time for a robust discussion is now, because I've heard candidates over the years say we should have a line item veto for governor, but I never really understood what that meant. I think it's time to get it all on the table. A convention that is not composed of General Assembly members in particular would be a good place for that discussion to take place. People can decide whether it's a good idea or a bad idea.
Representative Lally.
With regards to the line item veto, there are times I think that it could be positive, there could be negative. I think the governor of Texas, he didn't use it the last week or a few months ago. I believe he's indicted now for using it for his own agenda. So there are positives, there are negatives, I agree. I think that it may depend on what the governor uses it for.
Yeah, it could be, for instance, in Massachusetts, it's very limited. The governor of Massachusetts has a line item veto, but is very limited as to what he can do. Maybe that's the best way to go. I don't know. I don't know enough about the issue whether or not, personally, I would be in favor of it or against it. But I think it's time to get it discussed. The only place it can get discussed, really, as a practical matter, as an old ex-pol, is, quite frankly, in the convention, not in the General Assembly.
Ms. Jones.
In terms of the delegates to the convention, do you have any thoughts on categories of people who perhaps should not be delegates to the convention?
Well, no. I think any elector, certainly any voter, who is eligible to vote, can also declare for a delegate. I could tell you, in 1973, we had a slightly different plan. We had 2 delegates from 50 districts, senatorial districts, I think, in those days. And as a result, we had a variety of people that were there, all kinds of people who were very much involved in politics, people who were independents, people brand new, people who really didn't have a very specific agenda, except they wanted to do something positive for the state. And again, 72, 73, difficult time, especially in the ethical area. So we got a good crew of people. We were elected on a partisan basis, by the way. So you had approximately 57 Democrats, another 30 Republicans, and the rest of them were independents.
Were there any legislators who were delegates that you recall?
I really can't recall on the top of my head. Quite frankly, those who were involved in politics, former lieutenant governors, you name it, they were all over through the entire delegates. So whether or not any of them were in office at that point in time in the House or Senate, I just don't recall.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any further questions for Mr. Partridge? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members. I know that you've got a lot to do in a very short period of time. My sympathy is for you to come up with a process, come up with a report, and get it out to the public. Thank you.